Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Delegations from Russia and Ukraine are back in Turkey, returning to the same place where they held talks 3 years ago at onset of the Ukraine crisis. So what are the priorities for both parties? Can we expect any meaningful progress this time? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, what are the prospects for ending the conflict? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and Andrey Kortunov, Academic Director of the Russian International Affairs Council. Welcome to the show. We'll start with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So we know the meeting comes after weeks of diplomatic back and forth among different parties. Yet the talks remain clouded by sort of like uncertainty and mixed signals. For example, President Zelenskyy just tweeted that he and his delegation arrived in Ankara. And of course, there's a report of the arrival of Russian delegation in Istanbul, but he's not sure of the confirmation of the Russian participation. So can you please give us some context? Why are they sitting down this time around now?
Well, the situation is complicated because there are strong differences of view about what should happen next. There's one part of the U.S. government, and I think President Trump has this view that the war should end based on a set of criteria that include no enlargement of NATO to Ukraine so that Ukraine becomes a clearly defined neutral state. Second, that some territories shift to Russia, including Crimea, and at least parts of some other territories of Ukraine. And third, that security arrangements not be based on European troops in Ukraine after the conflict. Now, that view is opposed by other parts of the U.S. government, which say that the fighting should continue to get better terms for Ukraine. Many European countries oppose that kind of settlement because they also want the war to continue, ostensibly for better terms for Ukraine. My feeling is that President Trump is absolutely accurate about how this war should end. And the hardliners, as I'll call them, the ones that think that the war should continue for better terms for Ukraine, would end up destroying Ukraine. Because on the battlefield, if this war continues, Russia will win. And that is a reality. Of course, Russia will win at extremely high costs to both Ukraine and to Russia and to the world. So it's better win-win for everybody that the war ends. But there are hardliners and there are ones that want to make an agreement. In this case, President Trump wants the agreement. He wants concessions by Ukraine. And I think he's completely right in this.
Well, Professor Andrey Kortunov, of course, people are asking whether the reason for the two parties are sitting, talking to each other, whether they are genuinely exhausted by the war and they are seeking a path probably to peace, or is this more of a tactical move, part of a large strategic play?
Well, of course, we cannot say for sure. We don't know what people in Kyiv and in Moscow think about the conflict, people who really make decisions. But I think that societies are really tired of this conflict. And I think that a peace settlement would have been supported even before, and it would be supported now. As far as I can say about the situation in Moscow, there is clearly a sense of hope that we see some light in the end of the tunnel. I would say that the optimism is very cautious. There are many reservations. We do have hawks who do not want to have any ceasefire, but I still believe that the majority of Russians would opt for a ceasefire and, more importantly, for a peace settlement if this settlement is not beyond our reach.
Peter, what's the idea, of course, or the thought of the government in Kiev in participating the new round of dialogue with Russians?
Well, we can judge by the sort of level of representation that the Russian delegation sent. It could be considered a slap in the face of Donald Trump and his peace efforts, not to say another demonstration of the sort of disrespectful attitude that Vladimir Putin has assumed towards the Ukrainian president. He has time and again during the last 3 years considered him illegitimate, especially after Zelensky's term in office ran out, and under the constitution of Ukraine, we cannot hold another presidential election until the war is over. But he sent the same fella, Mr. Medinsky, who, Minister of Culture, who was there during the first Istanbul talks, if you remember, the first 2 months of the war in 2022. We are back to square one, which is a clear signal by Vladimir Putin that his terms for any sort of peace agreement with Ukraine remain the same. He talks, the Russian side, and the term they use is we need to get to the root causes of the conflict, and only then will Vladimir Putin deign to, grace, this process with his presence. As long as that hasn't happened, he will not and cannot be expected at any of these talks. So when we talk about these root causes, that means the same old essential capitulation of Ukraine, a no to NATO, disarmament to where its standing army would be sort of akin to Belarus, 50,000 or less. And so once again, it is tantamount to Ukraine's surrender. So Putin is sending a very clear message that he could not care less about Donald Trump's peace efforts. He can afford to go it along, for some time being. And now it is, I think, the ball is Donald Trump's court. How will Donald Trump react to that? Will he follow up on his presidential, promises that he made during the presidential campaign? He said that if one of the sides does not play ball, I will make it really hurt. He promised that if Russia doesn't play ball, he will give Ukraine more weapons than Biden ever did.
All right, I understand that the Ukrainian side would love to see, Russia or present Russia in the position of being against Donald Trump. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, you are shaking your hands. Tell us,
Yes, I disagree with every word that was just said. This is why Ukraine is destroying itself, because it does not face reality. It's not a concession not to be in NATO. NATO does not belong on the border of Russia. This is the whole point. The United States would never tolerate a Russian military base on the Mexican border or in Canada, and Russia does not tolerate an American military on its border. This is obvious and simple. And Ukraine was talked into an absurd idea of joining NATO by American hardliners, and it was completely unrealistic from the beginning. Every sensible person knew that it would lead to war. It led to war. And if you just say, as we just heard, which I don't accept for one word, that that's the same old story. That's not the same old story. That's the common sense to end this war. And this war needs to end. And Ukraine will destroy itself if it continues on this path of hard line.
John, give us people asking, well, we are back to square one, but is any party now with probably with a stronger hand, with some advantage?
Absolutely not. I think Russia goes into, or potentially goes into this negotiation with a very different situation from March 2022. It's clear that Russians on the battlefield are gaining upper hand. Just as we speak right now, the Russians are initiating a offensive around a 120 kilometers front in southwestern Donetsk. I think from Russia's perspective, the real conditions, I think President Putin has been alluded to already, Ukraine's voluntary withdrawal from all these 4 outblasts, denazification. That means that a whole series of policies introduced in Ukraine to protect the Russian heritage, but Russian language, not joining NATO, making sure that Ukraine will never be able to pose a threat to Russia again, meaning it has to downsize its army. All of these things, I think they are remotely far away from what Kyiv can accept. So I think going to this negotiation, they have very different perspective. President Zelenskyy, I totally agree with Professor Jeffrey Sachs that he is in the camp of the Europeans. They don't want to have a negotiation in the first place, but he desperately needs a 30-day ceasefire because his troops on the front line are in big trouble right now. So that is why he's saying that we need a 30-day ceasefire as a precondition for the negotiation. Of course, Moscow understands this very well. It's not going to accept it. Now he's talking about getting for at least a ceasefire into this negotiation. So I think from the Ukrainian side is very tactical objective of getting a ceasefire in the first place to make sure they can save its troops in the front line. From Russia's perspective, they have a long-term, very strategic, very broader set of goals. There is no way for Kyiv to accept.
Well, Peter, go ahead.
Very quickly, I just wanted to follow up to what Professor Jeffrey Sachs just said, and I just, when he's repeating, he's parroting Kremlin's line about how Ukraine is destroying itself. And this is what Kremlin is saying, as if Russia is not destroying itself by doing this, by losing 1,000 soldiers every day. This is a Kremlin's point. Ukraine is fighting to prevent the world order, the international law from being destroyed. It's doing a great favor to everything. And Jeffrey Sachs, I know Jeffrey Sachs. He was my professor at Columbia, and I interviewed him at a pro-Ukraine conference a few years ago. He was singing a very different tune. I would like to know what happened to Jeffrey Sachs to where he became a shame on the academic profession, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. In fact, it was Jeffrey Sachs' neoliberal policies in Russia in the 90s that actually led to the emergence of Vladimir Putin, as many Russians will tell you.
Come on.
Okay, why President Zelenskyy used to say that the precondition is like for a peace negotiation is the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, but now he's basically calling for a ceasefire of 30 days without conditions. Why the change of attitude?
If you're asking me, I mean,
yes, Peter, go ahead.
This is what is being asked of Putin or demanded of Putin by the Europeans and by Donald Trump. And I think it's actually a very reasonable test, a litmus test of Putin's goodwill, of Putin's genuine goodwill to have to put an end to this bloodshed. And if Putin cannot deliver even on that, very minimal requirements of him, like you said, no withdrawal of troops, something that would send a clear signal that he's willing to do this. As Jeffrey Sachs says, that this is just common sense. There's no common sense in what you're saying, Jeffrey Sachs. Putin is not willing to negotiate other than on Ukraine's capitulation, which will put an end to the international world order. I think it's shameful for you to sit here, and I'm ashamed to have been educated at Columbia with professors, with surrender monkeys like you.
Well, let's talk about
wait a minute.
what's going on.
Excuse me.
Yeah, Professor Sachs, go ahead.
The vulgarity of the language, the ad hominem attacks are absolutely unacceptable and are a deflection from the topics that we're talking about. I find it extraordinary to have that language.
Let's focus on the topic. Let me have Andrey. Andrey, so what is the purpose of the Russian side? There's a complaint of there's absence of President Putin. He's not here. That means like he's not serious. There's a low-level delegation from the Russian side. What do you make of that?
Well, let me start with saying that any conflict can end either by capitulation of one of the sides or by the political dialogue between the two sides. If we assume that this conflict will be resolved diplomatically, not on the battlefield, that implies that sooner or later, but the two leaders will have to get together and to discuss the problems and to get to some kind of an agreement. However, under the circumstances, I think we will all agree that for Putin, meeting Vladimir Zelenskyy is a significant political investment. So I think that what Putin is trying to do is to touch base with Ukrainians on a lower level by dispatching a lower level group to Istanbul. And if indeed there is some progress, at least very minimal progress, let's say, on prisoners exchange or on how to secure a ceasefire or how to move from a ceasefire to a more lasting peace arrangement, definitely the level of these contacts will have to be increased. Maybe the next step will be some kind of ministerial meetings, or maybe we cannot rule out a summit meeting. As I understand, recently the spokesman for Mr. President of the Russian Federation stated that the issue of legitimacy of Zelensky is secondary, and they would not use this issue as a precondition for any discussions with the Ukrainian side. I think that there is a margin of flexibility in the Russian position, and of course a lot will depend on how these negotiations that are supposed to take place this evening in Istanbul might go. Whether there is hope that the two sides might agree on at least anything, like, let's say, prisoners exchange.
Andrey, of course, the European Union countries are talking about a new round of sanctions, the 17th round of sanctions, if Russia refuses to accept the peace proposal or ceasefire proposal. Does that kind of a threat affect or impact the decisions in Moscow anyway?
Well, the next sanctions package has already been made public. There are certain sensitive issues in this package, but of course, it's not the end of the world. I think that Russia has used to living under sanctions. There is nothing good about sanctions. Definitely, it has a detrimental impact on the Russian economy. But it's not, as I said, it's not the end of the world. It's not something that will necessarily make the Russian leadership change its position on the Ukraine. I would say that maybe the opposite is right. Maybe sanctions make Russia's positions more rigid and less flexible. Because one of the characteristics of President Putin is that he usually does not yield under pressure. That is what he's known for.
John, you want to jump in?
I do see one potential flashpoint. That is the European side's plan to interject the so-called shadow fleet. I mean, these are the ships transporting Russian oil and gas to their customers overseas. If it develops into that direction, I think it's going to be very dangerous. That Russia is not going to stand by watching its fleets being stopped by the European side. It's going to take actions, and then it's going to get into a situation where it's potentially going to broaden the scope of the war, and I think that's very dangerous. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that President Trump has another sort of a more of a peaceful strategy here. He wants the oil price to be less than $50. That's why he's going to Saudi Arabia, going to Qatar to essentially persuade them to increase production. Russia's funding of this war is very much on a reasonable oil price worldwide. And I think if the price is below $50, it's going to severely, per barrel, of course, it's going to severely affect Moscow's ability to sustain this war. And I think this is something probably is more worrisome on the part of Moscow, I would say.
Yes. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, so basically both sides are under certain pressure, certain kind of pressure, probably oil prices or the situation in the battlefields. And then, how do you describe or characterize the role of the United States?
Well, I think Donald Trump wants out of this war. The United States does not want to fund Ukraine, and it will not fund Ukraine anymore. From the U.S. point of view, this war should end. And Trump has been very clear about that point, which is this is a war by Biden. This is a war by others. It's not his war, and he doesn't want this to continue. He's got other things on the U.S. policy platter. So I think the U.S. will not continue this large arming and funding of Ukraine. That's the reality. If Ukraine continues to fight, it will continue to lose. That's really the bottom line. The terms of the settlement were already established in April 2022. That's the basic point. The Istanbul process was nearly complete until Biden and Boris Johnson stepped in and told Zelenskyy, you keep fighting. And if one returns to those terrible decisions made by the United States and the UK, this has cost Ukraine dreadfully. And this is the basic point. The terms could have been settled years ago.
Mm-hmm. But what are the new terms to settle the conflicts from Trump administration? Seems like basically for the Ukrainian side to accept the loss of the territory and also no NATO membership. Is that the case?
Well, I think the NATO membership was the fundamental casus belli from the very start. It was a U.S. deep state project that went back to 1992 to surround Russia with NATO, even to help to dismantle Russia. They wanted to break Russia into pieces. This was an adventure of the U.S. Arrogance that dated back to the end of the Soviet Union. It was a dreadful mistake, exactly, starting in 1991.
Yes.
But really, we see the policies when you study the archives. This began in 1992, and it's been a long-term project, and it failed. And now Trump wants to end the U.S. Attempt to dismantle Russia, as it were, to surround Russia.
Okay.
And Ukraine, at this point, after having come to power in a violent coup, this regime in Kiev doesn't accept this reality. Okay, if they don't, the war will continue, most likely, and they will get dreadfully defeated as they've been losing terribly.
Okay.
That's not propaganda. That's just facts on the ground.
Okay, Peter, let me ask you, here's the question. If there's a failure, if the both sides somehow, failed to reach any agreement on ceasefire, on peace, and then the war will continue, can Ukraine afford with the continuation of the war?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's an open question. It depends. It will depend in large part on the resolve of the Europeans to continue helping Ukraine and to actually step up in their assistance in the absence of America's support. And that's also an open question whether Trump will, in fact, walk away from Ukraine without, once again, looking like a weakened power. And I think this will, and the Professor Sachs has omitted talking about what it will do to American credibility to have walked away time and again from its allies. Remember, in Vietnam, the Kurds, George Bush Sr., and the Afghanis, and that very ignominious decision to leave Afghanistan by the Biden administration, and those, the pictures that we saw. It does lasting damage to America's credibility. So Ukraine and the world cannot afford not to continue to resist this obvious black and white case of aggression, and the NATO membership is not the cause here. I wish the professor was a bit more astute in his analysis when he talks about the West wanting to dismember Russia. Is that what the George Bush the senior said in Kiev in his infamous Kiev chicken speech when he said, "Please do not run away, keep in the same family," when he exhorted Ukrainians to stay as part of the Soviet Union? I'm sorry, I don't know where the professor got his information, but the facts tell otherwise.
It's so ridiculous what you say. You don't listen to anything. I said that with the end of the Soviet Union, the policy went into overdrive. The speech that you just referred to was before the end of the Soviet Union. So please, at least listen to what I'm saying.
So that means the Americans wanted to prevent the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Let's turn to John. Go ahead, John.
I just want to make a point that European side alone is not going to be able to sustain this war. If the Americans shut the satellites off, they shut the sensors off, this war is not going to continue. It's not just about money and arms. Everything is driven by American defense capabilities. So I think with Donald Trump switching off this war effort, it's not going to nowhere. I think the situation, I totally agree with Professor Sachs that this situation on the Ukrainian side is going to keep deteriorating. Now, also, I want to disagree a little bit. I would say that at this point, NATO is actually, in my view, less of an issue. I mean, Finland has joined NATO. Sweden has joined NATO. I think more of importance to the Russian side, it's actually also another issue that's very different from the situation in April 2022, is that the Russians' demand has totally changed. It's not just about the two outblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, which are essentially conceded to the Russians in the 2020 agreement. I mean, this potentially signed agreement, it fell apart, of course. Now it's about these four outblasts. We're talking about Zaporizhzhia, the whole city is a population of over 500,000 people. Voluntary withdraw from that city. I don't think that the Ukrainian side is going to accept that. And a couple of other cities in Donetsk outblast. So I think the situation has totally changed. And the conditions the Russians are laying on the table have also changed. And I want to also caution the Kyiv side is that the further you prolong this war, the larger set of conditions the Russians are going to put on the table. And this is just going to be deteriorating.
But will U.S. say no to Moscow, John?
I think at this point, we should listen very carefully to President Trump. He put something very sensible on the table. The Ukrainian side needs to make concessions. And the Russian side, of course, have to also think about the long-term prospect of sustaining this war, the losses. President Trump talks about 5,000 soldiers combined on both sides every week. That's a lot of people dying senselessly. So I think, it's something, I don't usually, root for President Trump, of course, but on this Ukraine issue, I think what he said makes quite a bit of a sense here.
Mm-hmm. Andrey, lastly, of course, few are optimistic this round of talks will solve all the problems and then we will have a peace process. But what's your hunch, anything substantial we might achieve?
Well, I would say that at this point, and I'm sorry to say that, but I think that at this point, anything but a complete failure will be a success. Even if they're able to maintain some kind of contacts and gradually elevate them to a higher level, that would already be an accomplishment. We'll understand that it will be a long process and there'll be many disappointments ahead, and both sides will not get everything that they want, but we need to start somewhere, and I just hope that this day will not bring us a severe disappointment once again.
Mm-hmm. Peter, any expectation?
Once again, very few expectations. Once again, Vladimir Putin has once again sent a very clear signal. He's not willing to back down from his maximalist goal, and that is control of all of Ukraine. I agree with the previous speaker to say that his demands are growing. He will now expect Ukraine to leave the unoccupied yet territory of Ukraine. This is something undoable, and this is something even Donald Trump will not be able to give Trump.
Yeah,
Putin, sorry.
Professor Sachs, I know it's harder to predict, but any prediction of the end result of the crisis?
I think the war is coming to an end quite soon. The United States is not going to continue the war without the United States. Europe can't continue the war. I think that the war is going to come to an end soon.
Okay, John, you agree?
I will make some predictions about the negotiation. I think the negotiation is not going to generate very large results. They might reach some agreements about little things like exchange of captives, stop bombing civilian targets, things like that. But other than that, I don't see significant progress in terms of finishing up this war or stopping fighting.
Okay, so the fighting will continue.
But
yeah.
If the fighting continues, Ukraine will lose. So the war is going to come to an end soon because Ukraine cannot fight on its own.
On that note, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. See you next time. I'm Xu Qinduo.